In the blistering summer of 1858 in Brazos County, Texas, 4 men who had each paid for the same enslaved person died within months of their purchase, under explanations that read identical and bureaucratic on paper. Before we open the ledger and step into the barn where those sales were made, do one small thing now. Subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you are watching from, and one word for how this makes you feel. Because this story reaches across borders, and it matters where you listen. The county seat of Andersonville sat like a knot in a web of cotton roads, a place where freight wagons creaked, overseers barked, and the courthouse clock governed daily life. Dust rose from the unpaved streets, mingling with the metallic tang of sweat and the sweet rot of spilled molasses in the market. Plantations radiated outwards, each one an economy of rows and reckonings, where an overseer could be richer than a merchant, and a ledger could carry as much power as a law. Into that economy walked a man listed in those ledgers only by name and a note that would become infamous: Elijah Turner. Nobody in a market of men flagged him as singular at first. The bill of sale for Elijah looked like any other document filed in the probate office: buyer, seller, price, a bland notation of health and training. Yet the pages that followed formed a pattern so stark it could not be explained away by bad luck. Today, we will read those pages, listen to the medical reports that recorded the same cold phrase time and again, and follow how one man on the auction block changed the balance of knowledge and survival in a place that traded human lives as currency. Narrate this with gravity, with respect for the living and the dead, and with the curiosity of someone leafing through a sealed chest of small betrayals. Andersonville and the wider Brazos County were shaped by a soil that loved cotton and a climate that punished bodies quickly. Plantations there were not isolated estates, but nodes in a linked system of credit, harvest, and labor, where the overseer was the day-to-day law and the probate clerk was the keeper of reputations. The economy depended on the steady turnover of enslaved labor and on ledgers that recorded births, deaths, sales, and lines like a heartbeat. The town itself smelled of tallow and horse sweat, of ink on paper and coal smoke. Houses of worship stood beside mercantile stores, and the courthouse square acted as both market and public stage. Social hierarchy was rigid and spoken about in tones that accepted violence as practical. Men like Nathaniel Stokes could walk into a gallery and point at a person and, with a signature and the clerk's stamp, alter a family history. Yet rumor moved faster than legal paper. News that a buyer had died within weeks of making a purchase traveled by word. Of mouth, by whispered warnings at the bar of the general store, by letters folded and passed along with a care not to be intercepted. The Freedmen's Bureau was decades away from operating in this space, but the structures that would later be part of post-war negotiation were silently taking shape in the private conversations between field hands in cook shacks and in the margins of estate documents. It was here, in this economy of visible power and invisible knowledge, that the purchases of Elijah Turner would begin to create a strange map of mortality. The auction was a bright, noisy morning at Harlan's yard, a raised platform of rough planks in front of a clapboard store. Voices rose like a tide against the wooden rails, the ring of a hammer punctuated by calls from men in broad hats. The air tasted of dust and tobacco and the sharp citrus of a merchant's vinegar. A farmer named Silas Crow stepped up, a ledger tucked under his arm, and pointed to the man on the block with the same businesslike air used to select a horse. "Lot 23, called the auctioneer, voice thin with practice. "Field trained, 32 years, good with mule teams. The exchanges began with bargaining voices and ended with Silas signing a bill of sale for $220. Elijah stepped down, shoulders square, the sun catching on a threadbare shirt. He carried the smell of sweat and river mud and the slight copper tang of old work. On the way to the wagon, he answered a buyer's question with a steady, soft voice. "He will handle plow and herd," the clerk said. "No faults recorded." The scene held 3 more sensory notes: the clink of coins, the dull ache of a wooden collar when adjusted, the hush in the crowd when a child dropped a tin cup and it chimed on the cobblestone. Silas voiced a common worry aloud, asking whether there had been any fever recently. A county physician in attendance, Dr. Isaac Hargrove, stroked his chin and wrote in his pad. He would later testify that the paper read simply, "Healthy, sound for field work." That same evening, after 2 weeks of steady work, Silas Crow was found on his kitchen floor, face pale, hands clenched. The attending Dr. Hargrove recorded in his formal report the phrase that would recur, "failure of constitution." The funeral was quick, a rope of mourners, a closed casket, the standard prayers recorded in the church register, as if ritual completed justice. Yet in the kitchen and among the overseer's accounts, the scene felt off. The stew on the stove left half done, the tobacco pouch open, the ledger on the table bearing a new line that would be echoed again in the county minute books. In conversation at the tavern later, 5 men voiced similar puzzlement. "He did not look ill," said the overseer, Caleb Whitaker. "One day hauling lumber, next day he was gone." "I saw no sign of a slow sickness," said the clerk, Margaret Bell, voice low. "His hands were rough, but not frail." The pattern that began with Silas's death was the first small line of a drawing that would become unmistakable. At this point, pause and tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and pick one word that sums up your reaction: choked, incredulous, haunted, skeptical. Your comment is part of the record we build together. That community input shapes the way we investigate and guides which ledgers we request next. While you enter that detail, understand this: the ledger entries that followed became a chorus of repetition. 2 months after Silas, Nathaniel Stokes bought Elijah at a small estate sale, again with Dr. Hargrove present to certify health. Conversations between Nathaniel and his neighbor, Reverend Peter Ames, were long and detailed and were later recorded in a private letter that survives in the county archives. He said he could not imagine a man dropping like a stone, the Reverend wrote, and yet I saw grief and a confession like a flood on his face. Nathaniel's death was swifter than the first, and his certificate repeated the same official language. A third purchase followed, then a fourth, each with small differences in price and circumstance, but identical medical wording. Rumor grew teeth. The town's gossip moved from whispers to direct questions to the probate office. Marks in the margins of the ledgers began to appear, hand scribbles by clerks who had grown uneasy. "Too many similar entries," one said in a later deposition. The phrase "failure of constitution" transformed from bureaucratic shorthand into a riddle everyone felt they understood, but no one could explain. Around the third incident, the word spread to neighboring counties, and a social unease set in among buyers and sellers. People began to lower their offers on other lots and to ask for more thorough examinations. The market cooled, and the same ledgers that once recorded quick signatures now accumulated added notes, names of witnesses, and the faint scratch of someone trying to narrate what the legal paper refused to admit. Elijah Turner's backstory was not recorded in a single document, so we must assemble it from fragments that together sketch a life. He was born in the lowlands near the Brazos River, the child of 2 people listed only in passing in a prior ledger. In the first paragraph of his life, he worked as a boy in the plow lines, learning to read the sky and the weight of soil on shovels. The second paragraph shows a young man who taught himself to mend harnesses and to calm skittish mules, skills that made him valuable and that were noted in the margins of several bills of sale. The third paragraph marks a loss. He saw his mother sold away after a debt was called, a turning point that hardened his attention and taught him the math of passing information across cabins. The fourth paragraph brings him to 1858, where an aptitude for quiet observation and a talent for reading a man's face became his survival method. These four sketches together total a life both ordinary and exceptional in how resourceful it was under constraint. And they explain why Elijah knew the ledger and how to listen to the conversations that would later save him and unsettle a county. The pattern of sales accelerated into a sequence that made price behave like a thermometer of suspicion. After the first two deaths, buyers began to haggle down. At the third sale, a young merchant named Silas Broom offered considerably less, insisting on a signed statement about prior illnesses. A scene at a roadside inn captured the moment. Broom slapped a palm on the table and asked the auctioneer where the man had been prior to reaching this market. Voices rose. "There were flights in the ledger," said a traveling clerk named Margaret Bell when she later testified, and the notes had been crossed out as if someone did not want an obvious trail. The fifth sale was held in a different county with a different auctioneer, but the same pattern followed. A buyer paid a lower amount, promised to deliver a note, and died within a fortnight. The rhythm of sales and deaths introduced a collective anxiety and a need for explanation. Farmers, overseers, and clerks began to trade theories. Some whispered that disease in the river had resurfaced. Others, more cynical, said the man carried a curse. Theories multiplied because institutional authority could not offer a satisfying answer. The medical authority, Dr. Hargrove, continued to use the same language in his reports, projecting professional distance. Failure of constitution is clinical to the point of being blank. In private letters, he admitted being puzzled, but in his deposition, he framed the deaths as improbable, yet within the range of medical unpredictability. That tension between private confusion and public formality is where power nested and where rumors found purchase. Tension rose when a vigilant buyer tried to take control and the town realized that ordinary tools of verification were failing. The man responsible for the most dramatic attempt at surveillance was Caleb Whitaker, an overseer with a reputation for strictness and an unsettling belief in controlling chance. Whitaker decided he would not be dumbly surprised again. He arranged a watch in a slave pen and argued with Nathaniel Stokes about the wisdom of isolating the newest arrival. He assigned 2 men to observe Elijah's nights and demanded a written log. Those nighttime scenes are described in 3 exchanges captured in a tavern later that winter. "You think a man can hide his nature in the dark?" Whitaker told Stokes. "Nature shows even when sleep does not." "I asked for no tricks," Stokes countered, voice taut. "Just show me a sign." The night watch recorded nothing visible at first, only the rustle of straw, the occasional cough of a horse outside. The sensory details of those nights are sharp. The odor of stale tobacco, the whisper of cotton shirts against rough wood, the distant creak of wagon wheels. Then, on the third night, Nathaniel woke to find his house strangely silent. The lantern had guttered, and when neighbors arrived, they found him collapsed beside a writing table. The logbooks held by Whitaker showed the observer's entries in spidery hand, noting a silence that was louder than the usual ambient noise. That collapse became a second major moment of tension as the town began to consider whether watching could prevent what had been happening. In the most consequential dialogue of the story, Elijah finally spoke. This exchange took place late one evening between Elijah and a man named Reverend Peter Ames, who had once been a school teacher and who kept a small journal of confessions he collected to understand the human heart. The conversation is recorded in a private letter, fragmented but revealing. "Tell me what you see when you look at the men who come to the auction," the Reverend asked in a low voice. "I watch how they look at ledgers," Elijah replied, voice steady and close. "They reveal what they fear. When they count money, they show where they think death comes from." "Do you mean to say you chose what to do?" the Reverend pressed. "I chose to move where I was sent," Elijah said. "I learned how men sold fear in numbers, and I kept my eyes open. I learned how they counted breaths and deaths." "And when they died," the Reverend said, "did you intend to cause it?" Elijah's answer was not a denial, but a description of method. "There are ways a man can appear to fail that look like natural endings," he said. The Reverend scribbled that line and later considered it a confession. The dialogue contained 5 exchanges, each probing moral responsibility and survival in a system that made cunning necessary. It is impossible to know if Elijah's words admit premeditation or describe a practice learned to survive. The ambiguity itself became a source of moral unease for the community. There are 3 moments of concentrated tension that shaped public reaction and legal consequence. The first occurred at the Stokes household when neighbors found him collapsed, and the medical report recorded the same phrase that had filled prior pages. Men gathered in the yard, voices low, a palpable hum of fear and accusation. The second happened in the probate office when Margaret Bell noticed erasures in the ledger and confronted the clerk who had filed the original paperwork. The clerk broke down and whispered that someone had urged him to clean the record, to make the sales look normal. The third moment arrived when a deputized group attempted to restrain Elijah in the corn crib after a rumor suggested he had been tampering with rations. They caught only his calm face and the smell of river mud, but the crowd's anger was visible in fists and in a burning of straw that sent embers into a cold night. Each of these bursts of tension ran for long enough to shift minds and short enough to leave questions burning. Technical procedural notes appear in several documents and are essential to understanding how the county attempted to respond. The coroner's inquest, conducted by a magistrate and a physician, followed a standard process of the time: examination of the body for external signs of violence, inquiry into recent symptoms with testimonies from household members, and issuance of a certificate stating cause of death. In these cases, the certificates often listed constitutional failure without further elaboration, a shorthand that satisfied form but not scrutiny. Probate procedure for handling a deceased buyer's estate required immediate inventory of assets and a notice to creditors, which in these instances multiplied uncertainty because the suddenness of death led to hastily convened sales and the rapid movement of enslaved people from one ledger to another. These procedural descriptions reveal how administrative language could both conceal and create patterns. The institutional response moved slowly, and then with a blunt force. Sheriff James Mallory opened an inquiry after the 4th death, convening depositions and asking Dr. Hargrove to explain the repeated phrases in his reports. He named a small team that included Margaret Bell and a young deputy named Thomas Rook to gather witness statements. The sheriff's manner was public and deliberate. He called town meetings and encouraged citizens to bring any letters or strange notations. The inquiry revealed inconsistencies. Witnesses disagreed on times, on who had last seen the deceased alive. Some testimonies were precise and compelling. An overseer named Caleb Whitaker gave a long statement about a nocturnal watch and produced a logbook. A merchant named Silas Broom produced a bill for a strangely low sale price. A minister named Peter Ames offered his journal and the Reverend's letter in which Elijah spoke in a way that pointed to method. The sheriff's team faced a legal puzzle. They could not find a statute that punished an action that looked like natural death. No clear assault had been recorded. The evidence was circumstantial, and public sentiment complicated any straightforward prosecution. The decision to arrest was made not because of a single confession, but because of the accumulation of ledgers, reports, and testimonies that formed a pattern. Elijah was taken into custody quietly, with a small group escorting him from a field where he had been working on a harvest tie. He was placed in the county jail, a small structure of brick and iron that smelled of boiled clothes and damp wood. The arrest provoked two kinds of reaction. Some townspeople demanded immediate punishment, convinced that the repeated association of death and purchase could only be intentional. Others cautioned that no legal framework existed to adjudicate an act that mimicked natural demise. The tension erupted publicly when the deputy, Thomas Rook, read a list of charges, and a faction of townsmen pounded their fists, obscenely certain that confession equaled guilt. Nathaniel Stokes's widow wailed, Reverend Ames pleaded for proper legal process, and Dr. Hargrove looked both exhausted and oddly relieved that formal inquiry would proceed. The legal world at the time offered little clarity. The primary legal tool employed by Sheriff Mallory was a grand jury convened to consider whether an indictment could be found. The grand jury heard testimony about ledgers, about the repeating phrase in medical reports, and about the Reverend's fragmentary confession. Prosecutors argued that the deaths could not be natural chance given the striking repetition. Defense counsel, when allowed, framed the matter as a string of unfortunate coincidences corroborated by a physician of respectable standing. The grand jury failed to return a clear indictment in the face of conflicting expert opinion. Without modern toxicology or forensic methods, the county could not prove intent beyond reasonable doubt in a legal sense, even if a moral verdict felt evident in the square. The sheriff, dissatisfied, requested transfer of Elijah to a higher authority in the state capital to evaluate whether military custody would be appropriate in a time they described as requiring stability. That request foreshadowed how institutions sometimes opted for containment rather than full legal reckoning. One afternoon, in a rare private hearing, Elijah sat before a magistrate and a single witness, his voice measured. The dialogue there moved through 7 exchanges in which he explained his movements without claiming direct responsibility for deaths. "Did you know what would happen when you were moved?" the magistrate asked. "I knew how men looked at risk," Elijah answered. "I followed where they placed their fears." "Is that an admission that you acted to cause harm?" the magistrate pressed. "I acted to stay alive," he replied. "I moved with dignity in a system that offered none." The 7th exchange closed on a line that would haunt the archive. "Sometimes the only freedom possible is a narrow freedom, taken in silence." Those words complicated the stark desire for a simple moral answer, and split the community between those seeking vengeance and those who saw in Elijah a figure shaped by an economy that refused to consider him fully human. The decision for transfer was made under the pressure of public anger and military concern for order. Authorities arranged for Elijah's movement to the state capital, where a higher military official could determine whether his confinement should be maintained as a matter of public safety. The transfer itself was a spectacle wrapped in official paperwork. A warrant signed, a receipt for custody recorded, and a chain of custody documented in the ledger that held Elijah's name. He was physically moved at dawn with a small detachment, the smell of damp leather, and the grind of wagon wheels marking the journey. The official record of transfer included lines noting the time, the witnesses, and the commanding officer's signature. In town, commentators debated whether the transfer was flagrant evasion of legal process or a necessary expedient to ensure peace. The sheriff defended the action as a way to keep a volatile situation from spiraling into lynching, while critics saw it as another form of removing a problem without resolving the underlying pattern. The epilogue of this story unfolds over months in which the county, its ledgers, and the survivors adjusted to the aftermath. 1 month later, things had a brittle normality. Fields were planted, creditors called, and ledgers continued to be filled. Yet in the probate office, officials had added marginal notes, and the clerk, Margaret Bell, kept a secret copy of pages that she had circled and underlined in the dark. The town's conversations changed tone. People no longer spoke of Elijah's case as a private tragedy, but as an institutional anomaly demanding review. Small acts followed. Buyers began to insist on longer sighting periods, and some plantation owners refused to accept people sold without clear histories. The social mood was uneasy. Families of the deceased filed claims with varying success, and some asked for military oversight in probate hearings. The immediate sense was that the market had shifted, and that old assumptions about the safety of purchases could no longer stand. 3 months on, the broader legal and social consequences emerged more plainly. The state capitol's review produced an internal memo acknowledging gaps in local probate procedure and recommending changes in how medical examinations were documented. The military official who had overseen Elijah's transfer wrote that while there was insufficient evidence for a full criminal indictment, the pattern required administrative fixes to prevent similar disturbances. Freedmen's Bureau agents who later examined the case during Reconstruction noted the way information moved across cabins and courts and how that knowledge shaped bargaining power after emancipation. In personal terms, families of the dead remained unsettled, with some seeking reparations through private negotiation and others left with open ledgers and closed grief. The town's economic flows recovered slowly as buyers regained some confidence through procedural reforms and through a community willingness to question the official language of death. 6 months later, the legacy was clearer and more enduring. The ledgers that once recorded a man's price without question now contained longer histories, notes on prior ownership, and a new habit among clerks to request written attestations of health from physicians. The phrase failure of constitution, once an unexamined shorthand, began to appear less often because of a new insistence on more precise medical descriptions. The episode was cited in letters to newspapers and in later advocacy for legal reforms that would be part of Reconstruction debates. Perhaps most importantly, the story left behind a social lesson. Knowledge about how markets and men functioned gave a new currency to those who had formerly been without voice. Enslaved people used ledgers and rumors as a kind of clandestine strategy, recognizing that information could protect or punish. Danger. In the archive, the Reverend's Journal and Margaret Bell's circled pages sit beside probate filings as evidence of a moment when local practices shifted. The final line reads like a warning and a prescription. Systems that treat humans as inventory create incentives for covert survival strategies, and those strategies, once revealed, force institutions to change or to reveal their fragility. If this episode unsettled you, as it unsettled the county, subscribe to hear more investigations that bring archival silence into daylight. Leave a comment beginning with your state or city and one word about how this story landed on you. Your responses help us decide which records to request next and which stories to tease apart in future episodes. The ledger is a map that does not lie, but can be unreadable without close attention. The lesson from these 4 fatal stands is not a tidy moral, but a stubborn complexity. Some acts were survival, some were exploitation, and all of them were embedded in a system that prized possession over personhood. Remember that history is not just what is written in official scripts, but what is whispered in stalls and scribbled in margins. Sometimes the deadliest paths to freedom are traced in the small, quiet lines that a clerk might otherwise ignore. If this unsettles you, let it propel curiosity. We will continue to unseal courthouses and read ledgers with intensity and compassion. The truth may not absolve or condemn neatly, but it will compel change.